Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with and that I be allowed to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, all week my Democrat colleagues here in the Senate have been coming to the floor and using scare tactics and demagoguery on the so-called Ryan budget. And of course, what they're referring to is the budget that was passed by the House of Representatives months ago. And it's, I suppose, fair anytime you produce something to have that criticized and critiqued and scrutinized and looked at and discussed. But it seems at the same time that if you were going to attack the product that somebody else had put forward, that the natural follow-up question would be, so what are you proposing? Where is your budget proposal? And I think it begs the question, Mr. President, on behalf of the American people, that the Democrats here in the Senate who want to attack the House-passed budget haven't produced a budget of their own. Now, it's been over 1,200 days, 1,232 days, I think, to be precise, that we have not considered a budget here on the United States Senate. And just for those who trying to do that arithmetic in their minds right now, that's 3 years and 4 months. 3 years and 4 months without a budget in the United States Senate. That at the same time that we continue to get bad news about the economy. This week we received news that Moody's intends, if we end up going over the fiscal cliff next year, to downgrade America's credit rating. That would follow with other credit agencies, rating agencies that have already made that assumption about the American economy and the American fiscal situation. We also received notice last week that the World Economic Forum had downgraded America's global competitiveness. When President Obama took office in January of 2009, the world was ranked first in the world when it comes to global competitiveness. We dropped down to 4th or 5th, I think, here in the last year or two, but just in the last couple of weeks now, the World Economic Forum has dropped the United States even further. We are now 7th in the world when it comes to global competitiveness. And the reasons they cite for that are many, but it really comes back to the basic issues of spending and debt and taxes and regulations and red tape and the cost of doing business in this country. And it seems like, Mr. President, that the Democrat solution to that is to tax more so that we can spend more, raise taxes to grow government. That seems to be the only solution that the other side is willing to put forward. Now, I say that when I say that's the only solution because that's what we hear coming out of the White House in terms of the so-called fiscal cliff, in terms of the response to dealing with the sequester. Well, we could do away with the sequester if we just had more revenues. If Washington could just raise more money, more tax revenues from the American people, this problem would all go away. But what it misses, Mr. President, is the fact that the real issue here in Washington, D.C. isn't that we tax too little, it's that we spend too much. Washington has a spending problem that needs to be corrected. And at least the House of Representatives put forward a budget plan that addressed the fundamental problems that plague our nation's fiscal situation. If you look at what we're facing in terms of obligations, liabilities, responsibilities in the years in the future, Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, other programs continue to grow at 2 or 3 times the rate of inflation. That's not sustainable. That is going to lead us to bankruptcy. We are on an unsustainable fiscal path. The trajectory that we're on today cannot be sustained over time. And yet we haven't seen any proposal put forward by the Democrats here in the Senate, not just for this last year, but the year before that and the year before that. 3 years and 4 months now since the Democrats in the Senate have put a budget on the floor of the United States Senate that we would have an opportunity to vote on and to give the American people at least an idea about where we want to lead this country. And so when they come down here hour after hour, day after day, night after night, attacking the House-passed budget, I think the American people have got to say, and to the Democrats here in the United States Senate, where is your plan? Where is your budget? Show us what you would do. Show us how you would address the fiscal crisis that we're facing here in this country. The answer is there isn't one. It's nada. It's zero. There's no plan. There's no budget. There hasn't been. Not this year, not the year before, and not the year before that. For 3 years and 4 months now, there hasn't been a budget put on the floor of the United States Senate for us to vote on, for us to amend, for us to discuss, for us to have any kind of conversation about the future of this country and what we're going to do to address the fiscal crisis that we all acknowledge exists. This is the most predictable crisis, as has been pointed out, in American history. We all know where we're headed. You can look at the numbers. It's not complicated. It's not rocket science. It's simply a function of math. And the math is working against us, and every day that we wait, it becomes more complicated, more difficult, more problematic for us to solve this problem, and it further threatens the future and puts at risk our children and grandchildren and the quality of life and the standard of living that they're going to experience and enjoy in their lifetimes. So when the ratings agencies like Moody's come out and say that this fiscal cliff, if we go over it, means that a downgrade in the credit rating of the United States, when you have organizations like the World Economic Forum say that the United States is now 7th when it comes to global competitiveness, as opposed to 1st, which is where we were when the President took office, we all should take notice. It is yet another flashing red light. It is another warning sign. It's a red flag, if you will, that things are not well here in the United States of America. And yet, the only proposal that has been put forward that would address that is the budget passed by the House of Representatives. Why? Because the United States Senate, again, has not passed a budget. We haven't produced a budget now for over 3 years. And it's interesting because one of my Democrat colleagues who was down here talking on the floor earlier this week described the budget as a set of values in attacking the House-passed budget, that somehow the House-passed budget represented the wrong values, didn't represent somehow American values. Well, if a budget represents a set of values, what does it mean then when you don't have one? If you don't have a budget, what does that say about your values? It seems to me, at least, Mr. President, that at least the House of Representatives, to their credit, has put forward a proposal that, whether you agree with it or not, does address the fundamental problems that we have as a nation, and that is out of control federal spending, a trajectory with regard to entitlement programs that literally will bankrupt the nation, a tax code that is overly complicated, that needs to be reformed. Those were all addressed in the House budget. And a lot of people have attacked the whole idea in the House budget with regard to Medicare reform, which is referred to as premium support. Well, premium support is not a new idea. It's something that was popularized by liberal think tanks years ago. And in fact, this year, the House proposed idea when it comes to premium support was something that was advanced by Representative Paul Ryan and by Senator Ron Wyden here in the United States Senate. It was a bipartisan idea. It was also something that was advocated by the Rivlin-Domenici task force that looked at our fiscal situation, made recommendations, and when it came to the idea of, or the notion of how to reform Medicare, premium support was something that was put forward as something that could be a new idea that could save the government, the taxpayers' money, introduce competition in the same way that the Medicare Part D program has introduced competition and actually saved money over what it was proposed to cost. It's not a new idea. It is an idea that has been tried. When Medicare Part D was adopted, the premium support concept was including as part of that, and you can see the results of that have led to lower cost, much lower cost than what was predicted. And that's, frankly, Mr. President, I believe, because it introduced the idea, the element of competition into the whole way that we deliver health care services under Medicare. Well, that's something that was proposed and built upon, developed as part of the budget that was passed in the House of Representatives. But again, it's something that's not new around here. It's had lots of support in the past from Democrats. It seems to me, at least, that if we know what we've got today isn't working, we ought to be willing to at least entertain a discussion and a conversation about some ideas that actually might solve the problem and might work. Yet here in the United States Senate for 3 years, we have not had a budget. Now, some would argue that, that the President of the United States has put forward a budget, and in fact, as a matter of, I guess, just delivering a piece of, or a set of papers to the Congress, he did do that. But I would argue, and I think most would agree, that it wasn't a serious effort. It certainly wasn't a meaningful attempt to address the issue of spending and debt or entitlement reform or tax reform. And that was evidenced by the fact that when it was put on the floor here in the United States Senate to be voted on, it was defeated by a vote of 97-0. And the previous year, the House of Representatives had a vote on the President's budget. That year, it was voted down in the House by something like 419 or 420-0. The President's budget for 2 consecutive years here in the Congress hasn't received one vote from any Democrat in either the House or the Senate. Now, that should speak volumes about the President's attempt to do this. And I think what it suggests is that it was not serious. It didn't make a real effort at trying to address the issues of spending and debt and getting the economy growing again and reforming our tax code and driving down the cost of doing business in this country instead of increasing the cost, which is something that seems to be happening every single day here. I hear, as I travel across my state of South Dakota, as I listen to businesses from other parts of the country, the thing you hear over and over and over again is that the cost of doing business in this country is making us uncompetitive. We continue to be saddled with regulations, with requirements, with mandates, with taxes, and those sorts of things. The red tape of doing business in this country is making it incredibly difficult for our small businesses and our job creators to get this economy back on its feet and get it growing again. And so I would simply say, Mr. President, that in response to the attacks that have been leveled by my colleagues on the other side on the proposal that was advanced and put forward by the House Republicans, that it would bode them, I think, to, if you want to have a debate about priorities, if you want to have a debate about values, and if you want to have a debate about budgets, you have to have one. It starts with a budget. We don't have one. We don't have any plan for how we're going to deal with the very factors, the very elements that led organizations like Moody's and organizations like the World Economic Forum to determine that the United States credit rating is in jeopardy and that our global competitiveness has dropped from first in the world to 7th. Those are things that I think we ought to be talking about. And you can't start talking about those things unless you have a plan, unless you have a budget that describes what you would do to address the drivers of federal spending, the drivers of federal debt. And again, Mr. President, I can't emphasize this enough. The only thing I hear coming out of my colleagues on the other side to address it is we need more revenues. We need to raise taxes. We don't have enough revenue. If we just raise more revenues, we could solve all of these problems. Well, I would again say to my colleagues that what we have fundamentally here in Washington, D.C. is not a revenue issue. We have a spending problem. Washington doesn't tax too little, it spends too much. And that's why we need to get the spending under control, but it starts with the budget. And I think it would behoove our colleagues on the other side, as they come down here day after day and berate and attack and suggest somehow that the budget that was passed by the House of Representatives is not representative of American values, that they come down here with something of their own that might lay out a plan that actually does address Medicare reform, Medicaid reform, tax reform, the things that we know have to be dealt with in the future if we're going to hand a better and more prosperous and stronger nation to our children and our grandchildren. That simply hasn't happened. And they can come down here and say what they want, but there isn't any, when there's no budget, there is no blueprint, there is no plan, there is no path forward that addresses these difficult, complicated challenges and problems that face us and face our nation in the future. And so I hope that we will eventually see that. I hope that the President will come to the table and that we can sit down and talk about how we are going to solve the fiscal cliff that we're headed over at the end of this year. And again, it's not just the credit rating, it's just not global competitiveness, it is the American economy that's at stake as well. The Congressional Budget Office has said that if we go over this fiscal cliff, that where taxes go up on January 1st, where these cuts, these disproportionate cuts take effect on the military budget, that we're looking at an economic recession next year, a contraction in the economy of up to 2.9%, and unemployment above 9%. This is about America's standing, it's about our credit rating, it's about our competitiveness, and it's about jobs in the economy, fundamentally. And it is high time that we had help and cooperation and an idea, perhaps from the other side, about how they would solve these problems. I hope we will get that, Mr. President. I yield the floor.